Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon and welcome back to the afternoon sessions of the third Karachi Literature Festival. My name is Martin Fryer from the British Council. I'm very proud this afternoon to introduce a panel discussion. We're here to welcome Anatol Lieven, whose book, Pakistan, A Hard Country, is probably well known to many of you, but in case you've not read it, this was published last year. It's his latest book. Anatol has been a journalist, he's an academic, he's written about the United States, he's worked on several books about Russia, but over a number of years he's been coming to Pakistan, and the fruit of many a conversation with all sectors of society in Pakistan is Pakistan, a hard country. With us this afternoon, I'm very pleased to welcome Aisha Siddiqa, a scholar, a writer, a strategic analyst. She has a PhD in war studies from King's College London and is the author of two books, Pakistan's Arms Procurement and Military Build-Up 1979 to 99 in Search of a Policy, and Military Inc. Inside Pakistan's Military Economy. She's also a regular column writer in the Express Tribune. Also, welcome Mohsin Hamid. Mohsin, as many of you will know, is a novelist, and his well-known second novel, The Reluctant Fundamentalist, was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, well known to many of you, and his first book, Moth Smoke, is a particular favorite of mine. And lastly, Ghazi Salahuddin, the very distinguished journalist and political commentator who has been in the past president of the Karachi Press Club. So a warm welcome to them all. A round of applause, please. We're going to start to invite Anatol to say a little bit about his book and how he came about to write it. And then we will have a question and answer session from each of our three panelists. And then we will open it up to the floor for questions. Volunteers with a microphone are here, so look out for them with your question. Thank you very much. Anatol.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. Can you all hear me? Yeah? It's okay? Oh, good. And I'd like to thank the British Council and Oxford University Press, and indeed the Carlton Hotel, for making this great and very interesting event possible. So I'll try and talk too briefly. You understand the portrait of the book I'll give now will be very abbreviated and superficial, because I want to leave time not only for my colleagues, but also, please, for you to have a chance to to ask questions and raise any criticisms. This will be very abbreviated because the book tries to do a number of different things. It actually probably tries to do too many different things. The book was published at twice the length that Penguin commissioned it at. If it had been 3 times the length, I think they might have said no. It begins with a strong argument against the line, which unfortunately one hears a great deal too much of, in my view, in the Western media, but sometimes actually in Pakistan too, that this is a failed state, or a state on the edge of failure. Those of you who may have heard me speak before this week will forgive me if I repeat a line that I've often used, that you do not get events like this in a failed state or a failed city. I don't remember many. Thank you. The book ends with an appeal to US policy, Pakistan, which would risk pushing Pakistan in the direction of failure and collapse. I don't think that's likely, but if there is even a possibility, one must argue against it. And so I argue for a reduction of American pressure on Pakistan and for America and Pakistan to work together for a peace settlement in Afghanistan. That, I'm happy to say, is now beginning to happen rather than, well, I mean, the problem is Pakistan is often cast as still as the enemy in this regard. But in my view, actually, America and Pakistan are natural partners in a search for Afghan peace, albeit, of course, with differences. As to the book, perhaps in some ways I could best describe it by talking about the different provisional titles it went through. The first, and actually for me still my favourite, was How Pakistan Works. Both because it describes what the book is really about, but also because I thought it had a good radical sound to it, because of course so many people think that Pakistan doesn't work. The thesis of the book is that it does work in its own way, but that unfortunately some of the ways that keep it working are the same ways which keep it from working better. I use the phrase Janus-faced, in other words, good, one thing being both good and bad, so often in the book that my editor said he made 18 deletions, and there are still 6 left. The second provisional title was Pakistan, a Negotiated State, because the central thesis of the book is really about power in Pakistan. Where power comes from, who holds power, how power is exercised, how power is legitimized, and crucially also how power is negotiated between different centers of power. And I talk a great deal in the book about how where standard models of the modern state have decisions proceeding hierarchically and being implemented, or possibly not implemented, but in any case a clear-cut choice, laws being passed, clear laws, and then being followed. In Pakistan, so many things are a matter of negotiation, endless negotiation between different forces outside the state, within the state, and straddling the state and society. And I argue that, I, of course, more than in response to any questions, I'm more than happy to elaborate on what I mean by this. But I think many of you will know, who have worked in many, many different fields of Pakistani life, what I mean by this. And that so often things have to go through a long, long process of negotiation, constant negotiation, in fact, rather than clear decisions. Something that helps to maintain the resilience of this society. The book is also about the resilience of Pakistan, the toughness of Pakistan, and where this toughness comes from. But equally, this process of endless negotiation is, of course, in other ways, almost by definition, it helps to maintain stability, but it is very bad for radical development, fast development of the society. And I talk about all the different centers of power in Pakistan and how they interact. Both the formal institutions of the army, obviously, the political parties, the electoral system, the provinces, and then, and of course the judiciary, and then the informal systems of patronage, of kinship in much, though not all of the country, and of customary law through which, at ground level, things are negotiated in Pakistan. Now, one of the ways in which this is negotiated, as alas, I don't need to tell you here in Karachi, is through violence. That was in part why we came up with the final title, which is Pakistan, a Hard Country. This title was meant to suggest a number of different things. It was meant to suggest that Pakistan is, as I've said, a tough and resilient country. It was meant to suggest that, of course, Pakistan is a country with hard challenges. But it also reflects the fact that, yes, I mean, certainly when it comes to anyone who is in the business of authority or power, this can be a hard country in terms of how it works, hard in the sense of violent, and that violence can often be part of the negotiation of power. But most of the time, not of course as far now as the revolutionary militants are concerned, but most of the time historically in Pakistan that violence has been limited and for limited aims. It has not been absolute. The final section, but only the final section of the book, although the book of course takes place in the context of the rise of militancy and rebellion in recent years, the final section is about the Pakistani Taliban and their allies, where they come from, both in terms of deep historical traditions. We heard something from William Dalrymple this morning about the history of revolt under the banner of Islam in Afghanistan and among the Pashtuns. and of course, who originally helped sponsor these groups in Pakistan. I was here as a journalist in the 1980s, so I'm extremely well acquainted with the history of relations with the Afghan Mujahideen and their Pakistani supporters and what came out of that. And I look at this rebellion and I ask how much of a threat it is. And I come to the conclusion that I think since the spring of 2009, we have seen that the state and army can contain, defeat in some areas, and push back this rebellion, thank God. So, once again, Pakistan is not a failed state or in any imminent danger of becoming so. Finally, I must say, and there's going to be a panel about this tomorrow, writing about Pakistan. Once again, I mean, I've said, I've argued against Pakistan being a failed state. I also, although this was a book about power, and it's called A Hard Country, I also wanted to suggest that, contrary to so much of the reporting in the West, that in some respects this is also a soft country. This is a country in which it is possible to live happily, in which people have been incredibly hospitable to me, and it is only this hospitality which has made my work here possible over the years, and in which there are also so many positive features of this society. So, very briefly, thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Anatol. I'd now like to invite Aisha Siddiqa, our first questioner. Aisha, over to you. Perhaps give Anatol 1 minute to put the microphone on.
Is this working?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Anatol Lieven, for being here. I had so looked forward to having a one-on-one conversation, which didn't seem to happen, and I was informed about it since I landed, after I landed. But we'll still have this conversation. And I think it's important to recognize the fact and at least underscore it right from the onset, that we who are present here, we who write about Pakistan, take Pakistan very seriously. Besides many other things, Pakistan is home. And each one of us in our own ways want to make it more livable. It's just an issue of how do we perceive of this home, where we think, the problems are. And highlighting those issues is important. And for me, the conversation was important, but because for an author who has written a voluminous book on Pakistan, we as Pakistanis and, as an author from Pakistan would want to engage in a conversation to find out and to learn at the same time. I read this book with, deep interest and, like so many others. And there are certain issues which I thought that Anatol, you might want to kind of reflect on and talk about. But I would start off with, this basic question about, looking at events in Pakistan, what has happened, the Memo Gate, the conflict between the government and the judiciary, and the rest of the events, did they compel you or have they compelled you to reconsider some of your assessments?
Thank you very much, Aisha. That's an excellent point. Generally, what has happened over the past year, or more, has not led me to reconsider. I hope that my conclusions stand. It was the shall we say, very activist role of the higher judiciary and their becoming a new, one yet more, one of the centres of negotiation of power in the state was already apparent when I wrote the book. For example, just to take that case, Memo Gate. Is there anyone here who really knows what happened over Memogate? If so, please do tell me, because I don't. I wish I did, like so many things in Pakistan. The one thing I would say that has led me to, that I would have written somewhat differently was, now I say that this book is not, it's not mainly about the so-called war on terror and all these things, but of course it is against the background of that. I must say that on the whole I had been assuming up to last spring that clearly the Pakistani security establishment has shown very different faces towards different militant groups and alliances. Some of them by now extremely harsh, others obviously continuing to be more amicable, shall we say. Well, not amicable is not the word, but clearly the contacts continue. I had assumed, and I still do assume, but perhaps with less certainty, that the face turned by the Pakistani intelligence services, or let's say the ISI in particular, towards international terrorism, as represented above all by Al-Qaeda, had been in fact a harsh and cooperative with the US. And I thought that in part because, of course, so many Pakistanis, among many of you I'm sure, thought that it had actually been far too cooperative in terms of what the ISI was doing for the CIA. Obviously, the location of Osama bin Laden shook that and raised clear questions either about the competence of the agencies involved, and if that is the answer, then I would entirely agree with those critics who say that the heads of the agencies must take personal responsibility for that failure. Or, of course, there is the, sorry, I'm too far away, there is clearly the suspicion of some kind of complicity. To be perfectly honest, just like Memogate, I will not pretend that I have the answer to that. I don't. But that is something that I would have written somewhat differently, yes.
Thank you, Anatol.
See what I meant by reconsidering some of your assumptions, because, for example, at page 115, you talk about the PPP. You mainly talk about the PPP people complaining about judicial activism. It's page 115. But that is something, I mean, that complaint, that noise about judicial excessive activism that you hear from elsewhere, that's one. The other thing, which, I mean, and this is minor really, but the larger issue, and some of your critics have critiqued you for it, is that you take a softer position towards the military as compared to other institutions. And if you allow me to finish, some of the issues that you've raised in your first question yourself, which is questioning the competence of intelligence. Now, one of your themes is that, yes, Pakistan has power centers, Pakistan is a hard country, but within this hard country, the most or the better organization is the military itself. Now, would you want to reconsider that calculation, especially after May 2nd, especially after the attack on the Mehran base and other such incidents in which the military was actually not able to even protect itself?
Sorry, I didn't quite get the question about judicial activism, but I mean, I was already hearing those complaints from, and it must be said, not just the PPP, from other people as well within society about excessive judicial activism. While I was writing the book, clearly some of those complaints have become even stronger since then. So that I address very, very clearly. Concerning the military, a number of different things. First of all, I always use the term relative. Relatively honest, relatively efficient. I mean, I don't wish to be unkind, but sometimes in Pakistan, being efficient or honest relative to other institutions is not perhaps terribly difficult. The soft spot. I would like to say this. The book is very critical of certain aspects of military behavior. It raises the issue of not de jure but de facto corruption within the military, and I make a comparison there with de facto corruption in the American system, which is not against the law, but which ought to be, I say, which is by any moral standards actually corrupt. However, I would like to say that I have also in recent years visited military hospitals where the military wounded of the campaigns against the Pakistani Taliban and their allies are recovering from their wounds, often with disabling wounds. Young men who have lost both legs, disabled for life. They will go back to their communities, the Javans will, Potwa Plateau and elsewhere. Will they be honoured by their own local communities as they were in the past? Or will they be told, will they be asked why they took American money to kill fellow Muslims? Will they be threatened with excommunication by their mullahs? Something that might not matter to secular intellectuals, but matters a great deal to them. I do think that one must remember that with all the justified criticisms one should make of the military, that it is these Javans who are fighting up there so that we can meet here and have a free discussion. And any criticism of the military any criticism of the military must be accompanied by respect for their sacrifices. So that's one part of it. Considering the sort of issue of the relative efficiency and so forth, I warn very much in the book about the danger of a growth of radicalism, subversion within the military. And of course, when I wrote the book, Mehran is the latest one. Before that, there was an attack on GHQ in Rawalpindi. There was an attack on the ISI headquarters in Lahore. So I'm certainly not saying that the Pakistani military have done a perfect job of defending themselves, or God knows anyone else, not a perfect job. But I do have to say, as a Westerner, everything is relative. I could not say that the British or American armies have done a perfect job either when it comes to defending themselves against or the countries in which they involve themselves. Yes, I mean the military is an internally troubled institution. Obviously, of all the Janus-faced institutions in Pakistan, the military is perhaps the most Janus-faced. But still, in many ways, well, it's not they do play a positive role. In the context of the rise of rebellion in Pakistan, they have to play a role.
All right, let me get back. Listen. Let me assure you that we are very proud of the sacrifice of our soldiers. We recognize it. And in fact, if there is any internal domestic criticism of the military, it is for the sake of the soldiers. We don't want them sacrificed on the altar of the egos of, some officer cadre which doesn't even think. So, the criticism now, when you say relative, it's interesting because as a reader looking into your book, that relative is not in relation to the British military or the American military. This relative is in terms of other institutions. And as the critics would say, that once you compare Pakistan internally, your assessment comes in favor of the military. And if you allow me to quote an example, for instance, on page 77, while discussing Islam and Islamization, you seem to have, you seem to be more lenient towards military, including Ziaul Haq. On page 77, you say that impact of Zia's Islamization according to one interview that you have cited, is limited or superficial. Now, my question would be, how have you drawn this conclusion? And is it fair to make such an assessment on the basis of one, perhaps superficial remark? Because, in this audience, you'll have many people who have suffered, who have seen what Zia's Islamization has done to this country.
Please do not get me wrong. Naturally, I do not defend in any way, the Islamization policies of the Zia administration. And the book, I should say, on a number of occasions makes clear, in particular, my absolute conviction that women's rights and women's education are absolutely critical to the future of this country. So, just to, and insofar as Zia, in many ways, set that back, I'm dead against it. My point was a different one, and it certainly is not based simply on one interview. It's based on a very extensive anthropological literature, and on, I'm sorry to say, cases down here called Karokari and so forth, that one can see in the papers every day. And that is that across very large areas of the country, the countryside, but actually often in the cities as well, parts of Karachi, certainly large parts of Punjab, you have a society which, particularly in these areas that we've been talking about with Zia, is deeply conservative, not radical, but conservative in its approach to these matters. And Zia did not make a great difference there, one way or the other, as far as this massive society is concerned. This is not because these people are supporters of radical change. On the contrary, it is because they are attached, deeply attached to their own traditions. Rivaj, as it's called in the north. This argument was part of an argument in the book, which, look, this book contains theses. It doesn't contain the final answers, and I would never claim that it does. There can be there will be an endless debate about the correct balance on these questions. But the book argues rather strongly that the Pakistani state, in the end, whether under civilian or under military rule, is a weak state. It attributes this in part to the fundamental aspect of state weakness going back to the very beginning of recorded states, which is an inability to raise revenue. As I'm sure you all know, Pakistan raises the smallest proportion of its GDP in taxation of any country in South Asia. At the moment, I think it's barely 9%. That is only somewhat more than half what India raises in revenue, less than Sri Lanka and so forth. And this reflects the inability of the state, frankly, to force its elites, sorry to say this, to pay taxes. It just isn't strong enough. And therefore, I make this argument that actually the state has much less of an ability to get things done than we would wish. Now, sometimes most of the time, that's terribly bad. On the other hand, of course, if the state falls into bad hands, then this weakness of the state might actually be a good thing.
Right. I just have time for one more question, I'm told. You talk about women's liberalism, and you say that it's important. But going through your book, at least thrice, you use the word liberal almost in a
Sorry, what word?
Thrice in the book, at least, you refer to or you use the word liberal in a almost in a derogatory manner. I think in this country, some of the most progressive legislation and progressive events have happened because of this liberal element. That is one. And the other is, very quickly, I'll kind of roll it together. I just want to methodologically question the fact that, you've made certain assumptions. For example, page 27, you say that there is widespread support in Punjab, amongst the Punjabis, of LET and JUD.
Sorry, of what?
Of Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jamaat-ud-Dawa. You say that LET and JUD has widespread support amongst the Punjabis. Now, on several other occasions, you also use the term vast majority. Now, from a methodological perspective, how did you arrive at that vast majority when A, you have yourself challenged it subsequently in response to, for example, Shahryar Fazli's review of your book, and secondly, when you say Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jamaat-ud-Dawa have widespread support amongst the Punjabis, where does this assumption come from when majority of Punjabis are actually Deobandis and not Wahhabis, Ahle Hadith? So I'm so sorry for putting actually two questions instead of one.
On statements about majorities or minorities or large or small, I go with opinion polls, of which there are some very seemingly reliable ones in Pakistan. This, as far as Jamaat-ud-Dawa and Lashkar-e-Taiba are concerned, I base it on my own interviews on the street in Pakistan, informal ones, yes, but repeated over years and years, in which I have found this sympathy to be very strong. And I should say that that is true not just in cities in Punjab, but also in a Punjabi, Mirpuri city called Bradford, where unfortunately there is immense sympathy for and support for the Kashmir Jihad and for those who are seen to have fought and sacrificed themselves. In saying this, you naturally will not think that I am making myself a statement in support or sympathy for these people, but it is necessary to look things in the face. And this, alas, has been reflected not just in donations, which have flowed to these organizations, but also, of course, in the extreme difficulty that has been found in prosecuting these people or implementing detention orders, because within the judiciary too, as we know, and they are also Punjabis and reflect sections of Punjabi middle-class opinion, yes, unfortunately, tragically, there is sympathy for these groups.
Thank you.
And my first question, which was, your about liberals.
Do you want to just answer the question about liberals, and then we'll move to Mohsin?
Look, when it comes to issues of women's rights and many other things, the rule of law, we're on the same side. I am, of course, a liberal in these matters. I make that extremely clear in the book. I can't remember where these things come in, but certainly there can be no doubt reading the book, of my commitment in these areas. There are 2 points. I mean, the first is that I believe I'm right in saying that not every woman in Pakistan is a liberal. No? In other words, we must certainly support and encourage these tendencies. We also have to recognize that there are very large numbers of people who disagree with us, unfortunately. But in a democracy, their opinion also has to be taken into account and respected.
Thank you. I'd now like to invite Mohsin Hamid to ask his first question.
When I hear the applause in the audience, it feels like it's a table tennis match, and somebody scores a point. I think I'm here as a novelist, so to give a little bit of comic relief, but I don't really have anything funny to say, but I really, I found very interesting that one of the starting points for your analysis was an examination of the clans and kinship groups and biradaris that make up Pakistani society. I think that's a look at Pakistan, which for me was nuanced and quite different from a lot of foreign non-Pakistani commentators on Pakistan. And I'd love to know a little bit more, or for the audience in particular, you know, how does Pakistan's makeup and the central role of these biradaris shape what this place is?
Well, here, actually, here's something else that I might have changed a bit as a result of the past year. Because it's about power and how power is exercised in this country, mostly, you could take the book as being very hostile to kinship groups, because I see them as not universally in Pakistan. I make very clear that that's not true of most of Karachi, for example, but in other areas of the country, as very intertwined, sometimes centrally intertwined, with the factions which basically operate what I see as the central operating procedure of Pakistani politics, which is to extract resources from the state through, call it corruption, if you wish. Yes, let's call it corruption, actually, and distribute these resources to their followers, and I point out that, once again, not universally, but in very extensive parts of the country, including, for example, interior Sindh, kinship is central to this. Equally, in the chapter on rival judicial systems, I mean, once again, you know, open the paper any morning and you will see yet another ghastly case of where a woman or a couple have been murdered, you know, as a result of deep, deep kinship loyalty and the enforcement of kinship rules. However, I do talk in the book also about how the closeness of families, you know, gives Pakistan its resilience, but also its charm and its warmth. Now, the thing that I might have written a bit differently was not as a result of anything that happened in Pakistan, as a result of something that happened in London and elsewhere last summer, and that was the riots starting in Tottenham. Whereas what you saw was gangs, masses of youths, with no allegiance to anything, but anything starting with family, with no families, no family ties, that none of the basic discipline and morality instilled by families, and of course no religion, in fact with nothing actually, except a crude and savage materialism, in which, by the way, I am not trying to excuse the behaviour of British bankers either. And at a certain point, what did they do? Well, they ran into rows of Pakistani origin, people from the Pakistani community in Britain, defending their own shops, yes, but you could also say defending basic order and civilization. And yes, Pakistani shopkeepers who no doubt have an excessive sense of family, again. But I might have said that all the same, even if that sense of family is excessive and can be savage, if I had to choose, which pray God I never do, I know which side I'd choose. Thank you.
One of the things that emerges from your book is when you have all these clans and biradaris and tribes and kinship groups, Pakistan begins to look a little bit less like a nation and more like an international creature. And you have a very interesting chapter in your book about the judicial system or law in Pakistan, and how all of these different clans and the need to intermediate between clans sets up something that competes with a Western system of individual rights and individual justice. And I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about how you think the Pakistani justice systems work, and then also a little bit about, given what's happening with the Supreme Court and with Memogate, etc., how those factors are playing in what we're seeing happening right now.
Oh dear, how long do we have? My students say I'm like the Energizer Bunny, you know, on these subjects. You wind me up and they're 6 hours later they're all asleep.
5 minutes, Anatol.
I see judicial orders, I mean, questions involving, judicial processes and judgments in the broadest sense as very much part of the negotiation of power that I talk about in Pakistan. And that is true of the state judicial system. It's true of the Sharia, where as it is implemented, and it is true of course, the informal systems of customary justice that you see in much of the country. I've made quite an extensive study over the years of the workings in practice of the Pashtun Valley in this regard. A system which is fundamentally about not quite different, you see, from the basic Western and Western-derived official Pakistani legal system, which is formally about ending injustice and ending violence. The Pashtun Valley is more like international law. It's about mediating violence, compensation, compromises, restoring basic social harmony. I see all these three systems existing together, overlapping, people moving between them. But at the heart of ordinary people's interaction with these systems, and no doubt as it everywhere in the world, you could say to some extent, you have two things. One, in the particular, you have a desire that the system will work for you. The difference in Pakistan is that you can move between different systems at ground level very often. A key problem, as I'm sure anyone working in the judiciary or the police will know, is that in practice, corrupting the judicial process, putting pressure on it, and above all, lying to it, is rather extensive, shall we say, when it comes to how the system works. On the other hand, there is also a deep desire for justice. Justice and accountability, which of course is deeply, deeply rooted in Islam and the Islamic tradition. And I think, one of the things that one saw with the Chief Justice and the lawyers' movement and their resistance to the government of General Musharraf, and the tremendous wave of sympathy that this caused in Pakistani society, it does show this desire for justice and for the judiciary to bring some kind of accountability for those in power. Of course, the curious thing, and I hope not to give offence to any lawyers or judges present, is that this coexisted among the same ordinary people I talk to, with at the same time, as I fear we all know, a very considerable distrust of the judicial system and its members. So these things, it's all part of the negotiation, a negotiation which goes on, within the same people's heads, as well as between centres of power. As to, yes, Pakistan being, the book does try to bring out the deep diversity of Pakistan, of every Pakistani province, almost of the society, the religious diversity, the cultural diversity. Am I running out of? Sorry. But and that is entirely true. And I quote somebody from Lahore as saying that we Pakistanis we can't agree on a revolution because we're so diverse we can't agree on anything. But I think that this diversity, this has to be accepted in Pakistan as a given. And one shouldn't sort of, compare Pakistan to Pakistan's, denigration to some kind of absolutist Western state model. Actually, if you look around the world, certainly a great many states, probably actually most states, and certainly most post-colonial states, are not uniform monolithic nation states. They are very diverse. And the question is how they can live with that diversity. And clearly Pakistan has had terrible problems in that regard. And yet, it's still here.
Thank you, Anatol. We are running a bit late, so with all apologies to Mohsin, I'm going to move on to Ghazi. And Ghazi, please, your question. And it may have to be one question so we have a chance for the audience.
So I have only one question to ask. Anyhow, Anatol, let me first commend your star power. Because one has not seen so many people on an occasion like this. Usually we don't have a large gathering in literary functions. The other thing is that we are always very respectful of opinions expressed by foreign writers, foreign magazines. And I think in this case, we welcome a little dose of tranquilizer that you bring, because we know the situation to be slightly otherwise. One thing that I have noticed is that there is, in my view, not enough attention devoted to the state of society in the context of its intellectual, cultural deprivations. And that, I think, is the real crisis in this country, what I call the de-intellectualization of society, and what is the kind of environment you have on campuses of our public universities, the level of debate, and you can connect it with the level of intolerance where it's difficult for people to express their views. And also how the situation has changed in 2011. Your book mainly was written, I think, in 2009, your interviews, your visits. You have briefly touched upon Salman Taseer's murder, but what happened after that murder? The manner in which Mumtaz Qadri, his assassin, has been sort of, and the manner in which the government was unable to take them on, does it not contradict the very spirit of the book? What happened?
Well, the thing is, I do not say in the book that Pakistan is not a country, with tremendous difficulties and challenges, because I do. And I talk throughout the book about the weakness of the state, which embraces, of course, amongst other things, the weakness of the state education system. And I talk a great deal about the inability to spread literacy, I mean, the low levels of literacy. Especially for women. I don't, it's true, get into the decline of higher education so much. And it's perhaps true, yes, that in arguing against the, I am after all a Westerner, and I worked in Washington for think tanks for many years. It may well be true that in pushing back against this endless failed state demonization line, I may have pushed a bit too far or too hard. But certainly, I do talk in the book about the decline, the problems of education, amongst other things. As far as the Taseer assassination and the response is and what has happened, well, I'm afraid no. It brings out what I've been saying about how in Punjab, there is extensive support, including, alas, within the judiciary for radical Islamists. Well, not just radical, but because, of course, his assassin was not a radical, he was a conservative, but radical and conservative Islam. And yes, to my horror, it was a retired Chief Justice of the Lahore High Court who, in an interview, justified Salman Taseer's murder to me on the grounds that the laws of God take precedence over the laws of man. If one were looking at some of the things that you've just mentioned, you need look no further than that. So no, I think I do actually take account of that.
One last question.
One last, and then could the holders of the microphone be ready to react to questions in 2 minutes?
May I? Yes. To complete the circle, let me come back to the army. In your book, you have alluded about a psychological problem of the army, and one excerpt that our friend Khalid Ahmed had quoted in one of his columns, saying how armies being India-centric and its obsession with Kashmir could or may threaten the very survival of this country. Would you?
No, I entirely agree. And perhaps I didn't phrase this quite clearly enough in the book, but I did in a subsequent essay, that one of the internal strengths of the army, as far as the generation of morale and discipline is concerned, is that certainly, once again, relative to any other Pakistani institution, it has a very, very strong sense of Pakistani nationalism. This is instilled from day one in the soldiers, in the officers. And that is what gives it its internal coherence to a great extent and discipline. On the other hand, as I talk about in the book, now this is by no means unique to Pakistan. One could almost talk of it as a general rule that nations have been created out of hostility to others. You know, you are a Pole originally because you're not a German or a Russian, and that is how you bring a nation together. In the case of the Pakistani army, as I say in the book, this obsession with India has been extremely damaging, with India as the national enemy. And yes, I mean, the sponsorship of militant groups fighting in Kashmir after 1988, well, you will hear from officers themselves in private. Yes, we created a Frankenstein's monster, and it's come back to attack us. And once again, it has come back to attack them as well as Pakistan in general. I entirely agree. The obsession with India is something which I wish that the military, and of course not just the military, but extensive areas of society, could get away from. I would, however, like to say that in saying that, I am by no means saying that all the fault for this is on Pakistan's side. India does also bear, particularly, of course, because of its behaviour on the ground in Kashmir, a very large share of the responsibility. And, of course, if you wish to go back to the beginnings of this issue, who could you say bears the greatest responsibility of all? Well, yes, it's Britain. I'm very sorry to say.
On that note, thank you. Could you raise your hand if you have a question? We're going to have to keep it to 10 minutes. Please, questions only, not statements and we'll put Anatol on the rostrum. Okay, right. The gentleman is holding the microphone, and then the lady behind.
First
of
all,
I'll
sorry,
take one from
may I
over
just
there.
say, I'd like to thank my colleagues on the panel very much for their questions, which were extremely interesting and challenging, and I hope that you found the interchange interesting.
Yes, I enjoyed reading the book very much, and I also agree with Ghazi Saab when he said about this, a little bit more emphasis should have been placed on the de-intellectualization of society, as you said. And I think a lot more emphasis should have been placed, and we're all looking at probably the ideal book, and nobody, you know, everybody's asking you the promised Messiah who's got all the answers. Nobody does. But still, I think more emphasis should have been placed on how the various stakeholders are contributing to the resources and how they are willfully not contributing to the resources.
And so forth. Well, I did emphasize that. Some people think that I emphasized that too much at the expense of the destructive effects of military rule, but I would entirely agree. I mean, that is fundamentally why Pakistan has the lowest rates of revenue collection in South Asia. Why Parliament, why, for example, last March when I was here, the mini budget with various revenue-raising, new revenue-raising mechanisms, new taxes, had to be passed by presidential decree because the president himself could not get it through a parliament which his own followers control. Because, of course, I mean, they don't give a damn whether they're in government or not in government. What they do give it, I mean, from that point of view, when it comes to government policy, what they do care about yesterday, today, and all the time is their own incomes. Oh, the lack of political leadership. Well, yes, but the problem is that lack of political leadership, political leadership does not appear as a miracle out of a vacuum. Political leadership is generated by particular societies and economies in particular circumstances at particular times. And I'm afraid that on the whole, I would say that the way in which Pakistani politics today is structured and the way in which the system as I see it works, shall we say, does not encourage such leadership to emerge. I hope very much that it will. But I fear, and once again, this is hardly an original thought, one can read discussions of this every day in Pakistan, that even if new leaders do emerge, they may find themselves forced to operate in the same old ways in order to gain the necessary support from the elites.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
You know, in the last 30 years, discourse on Pakistan has been defined by sort of anxious young women like Marianne Weaver, Christina Lamb, Emma Duncan, perhaps Pamela Constable. Their variety of discourse is different from the intellectual rigor that I found in A Hard Country. Why do you think A Hard Country in discourse is often reduced or distilled to a binary, whether the question posed is whether Lieven is pro-army or not, or against the army? I mean, there is much more to A Hard Country than discussion of the army, and I don't think at any juncture on page 70 or 211 you take a moral position on the role of the army. It's, to my understanding, it's an analytical, but why do you think it lends itself to this this sort of thought?
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I wouldn't, Christina in particular, I wouldn't describe her as anxious. She's actually extremely brave. But certainly, I try in the book, yes, to take a cool, analytical view. I mean, but interspersed, I hope, with moments of warmth and indeed humour. Not all the humour has gone down well, universally, but anyway. On your central question, well, I mean, the thing, well, first of all, yes, I should say, just to make my central argument about the army clear, I have a phrase in the book where I've talked about the relatively greater honesty and efficiency of the army, relatively, as stemming in part from nationalism, higher morale. But of course, I also say, within the context of my general thesis about Pakistani politics and patronage, that you could also see the army as behaving like a kind of giant political biradari or faction, extracting massive resources from the state and distributing them to itself. Now, albeit generally in an orderly and not kleptocratic fashion, but yes, I mean, immense benefits, and not just to the army as a whole, but also to, in a graded fashion, the generals and officers within it. So yes, I mean, this is an attempt, not at an emotional argument one way or another, but simply at an analysis of how things work. Now, at the same time, I mean, naturally, you get sometimes within the army a feeling, we're being unfairly criticised. Well, yes, sometimes they are unfairly criticised. But of course, also a feeling that nobody should criticise us, that we are immune to criticism. We should simply be respected, as defenders of the country. Well, I have to say, if that's what you want, don't take over government 3 times. Because once you're in government, you can expect criticism, and you get it. So, obviously. I mean, on the other hand, I do have to say, well, there are 2 things. One is, this book is in no sense an argument for military rule. On the contrary, very great extent, and we certainly saw this under Musharraf, ends up governing not through necessarily the same politicians, but very much the same kind of politicians who operate in the same kind of way. So that's one thing. So it's in no way an argument for military rule. I also talk about how, when people move out of the military into politics, and they can become as corrupt as anybody else. I would say, though, on the other hand, that the military and military rule are sometimes used as an excuse for not looking very hard at the behavior of the political elites. The failure of revenue collection, that fundamental issue, and the failures of government when they are in power. It is simply not good enough to do nothing, to be in power for however many years it is, then to lose power, and then to blame all your failures up to that date on the military. The military can be a very convenient scapegoat.
We have time for 2 more questions, I'm afraid, because we're going to have to finish. One question here, please.
I mean, what do you anticipate? I mean, you have an excellent account of the various social institutions. What do you anticipate with how these power dynamics will ever be changed? I mean, there's never been a French Revolution here, and the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan may not be the best alternative to be thinking about that. So what will it take to change these systems of power and patronage so that governance you've done this analysis, so that governance can actually work?
Short term, I should like it to be known that what I'm about to say is neither an endorsement nor a critique of the Tehreek-e-Insaf. But I think one sees, at least in northern Pakistan, not perhaps here to nearly the same extent, both a tremendous desire for change among a great many Pakistanis, and especially Pakistani youth. I was very, very struck in this time. But actually, when I've been, the last several times I've been here as well, talking to people on the street, talking to people in colleges, by the extent of this support, the desire for change is there. And I believe that in principle, this can lead to improvements. And the book is not a portrait of a static Pakistan. It brings out how the country does change, has changed over time, including in positive ways. And I talk in the book about the Finance Commission Award. The 18th Amendment came later, but building on the same thing. But I believe that limited things can be done in the short term, despite, as I say, the, alas, strong likelihood that the compromises that will have to be made will undermine, a revolutionary change, shall we say. In the longer term, I would say that the change will come if it comes essentially through urbanization. But not by urbanization, I don't just mean, masses of people moving to the towns and continuing with informal employment or semi-employment and so forth and so on, because that doesn't hack it. At that point, you can make cities of 30, 40 million people still essentially carrying on in non-modern ways, to use a gross simplification. If, however, you have urbanization leading to a growth of the formal economy, and of course, following on from what Ghazi said, a growth of education, creating new educated middle classes, then I think you will see in Pakistan new political forms and solid movement for change. Apart from anything else, at its simplest, a movement to redraw the whole constituency map in order to make it correspond to actual demographics, rather than, as now, very considerably weighted in the direction of the countryside with all its traditional forms and factions. The one thing I would say there, though, and this brings me back to the fact that Pakistan is a diverse place, and Islam in politics is bound to play a part. If you look at the example of the Arab world, elections there, since the overthrow of the dictatorships, if you look a little further back to Turkey, it does seem extremely likely that urbanization will lead to new forms of mass Islamist politics. If, however, these are based, as in Turkey, on a new economy and new middle classes, then these Islamist parties will be modern, moderate, and themselves committed in many ways to positive change and development. If, of course, this is simply a result of a continuation of existing urbanization and social forms, then the results could be much grimmer.
One last question,
Yes,
then we will have to finish.
Two of my questions have been answered, so my questions are very brief, but I'll just make on the lighter note the comment Ghazi made about your being the luminary. You are, and I don't mean to take that away from you, but the crowd here is also for the very luminous panel that we have. Aisha, Ghazi, and Mohsen. We came running to them being surrounded being around you. So, Ghazi, that was the reason also. I'm saying that two very brief observations that I haven't read your book thoroughly, but because I had been through that tiny little process of ISPR, taking any person investigating, reporters and all. I also went with two journalists who were very anti-army, and I'm sure Aisha and all might relate to it also. When the DG ISPR took you around the tour, does that, from your comments it comes through, influence your perception or your analysis on the army vis-a-vis their ruling and the Jawans, as you mentioned, because they really do a very convincing tour media-wise over there. And my second was that you did not quite reinforce Aisha's observation about Barelvis being the largest sect theoretically in Pakistan, but I do agree with you, there's a very strong tentacles of Wahhabism and Deobandis and Saudi-funded organizations that are penetrating and are sitting we are sitting on a time bomb from that middle-class, urbanized, conservative lot that overshadow the larger Barelvi and Shia groups in Pakistan. So she's right that there is theoretically the larger group is that, not from where the Qadri came. Do you endorse that? And were you influenced at the DGISPR? My other questions have been answered. Thank you.
Thank you.
I should say, the only help I have received from the ISPR during all my visits to Pakistan has been facilitating 2 trips to Swat. Now, I mean, you've just come back from there. We don't need the ISPR. But at one stage, you did. I mean, especially, of course, if you wanted to go and see soldiers. And visiting military hospitals, obviously you can't just walk in, and interviews with generals in certain places. I think you'll agree that if a book is partly about the struggle against the Pakistani Taliban and their allies, then talking to the generals and soldiers involved in fighting them is probably going to be useful. However, none of my other researches in Pakistan, including extensive periods spent in the NWFP and last year as it's become Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, none of them have been sponsored by or linked in any way to the ISPR. As to whether they've influenced me, well, that's Attar Abbas's job. As you may know, he has rather distinguished journalists in his family, so he's used to, no doubt, arguing with journalists. He's very good at it. But then I have met an enormous number of highly articulate people in this country trying to put across one line or another, military, political, whatever, and I have responded with polite skepticism. As far as the Barelvis are concerned, look, once again, of course, this book, naturally, I am absolutely delighted that so many Pakistanis have read it and many have approved of it. Some have approved and disapproved, others have disapproved completely. But of course you have to remember that it was also written for an educated Western audience and policymakers who are not acquainted with Pakistan. very closely and who have a terrible tendency to get their impressions of Pakistan from very simplistic Western models and statements. Now, of these, one of the most simplistic and in many ways most damaging is this perception, this talk about Muslim extremists. And often extremist is equated with fundamentalist, and fundamentalist is equated with conservative in a way which produces the most ghastly intellectual muddle. On the other hand, it is said there are moderates, which is in Pakistan is often called the Barelvis and so forth. And in much of the Western discourse, I have to say, you'd often think that being an Islamic moderate, a Barelvi, in this perception, means liking American policy. I cannot say that I have found this in talking with most Barelvis of my acquaintance. I hope you'll forgive me if I say that a moment in Washington, which didn't get a laugh, but I was arguing against this whole line, was when I asked if I thought that a CIA policy of supporting Barelvis and Sufis against Wahhabis and Deobandis would be good for American policy. Not, by the way, I'm saying that this has actually happened, but it was discussed. I'm sorry to say that I replied that I thought that if you were really going to help American policy, it would make more sense to use the FBI to support the Episcopalians and Methodists against some of the evangelicals. I'm afraid people didn't laugh very much, but I thought it was funny, but then I think many things are funny that other people don't disagree with. But I mean, the point is that you have in Pakistan a body, a very, very large body of conservative, with a small c, Islam, which you can, if you wish, put under a sort of general coverall of Barelvi, although it's a simplification. This tradition, or traditions, because of course there are a number of them, is in many ways deeply hostile, of course, to modern radical Islam as represented by different groups and parties. And of course, one must remember, has come under savage attack from the Tehreek-e-Taliban and their allies in recent years. Dreadful terrorist attacks on some of the most beloved shrines of Pakistan. At the same time, this conservatism, it does not in any way indicate two other things. One is that Barelvis, deeply believing Barelvis, ever have or ever will take kindly to what they perceive, rightly or wrongly, as insults against the Prophet. In the case of Salman Taseer, I would stress that was wrongly. Alas, the perception was otherwise in certain quarters. And the second thing, once again, is that being a conservative Barelvi, or a conservative Muslim, being deeply hostile to radical Islam, does not make you a supporter of American foreign policy.
Thank you, Anatol. I'm afraid we are going to have to finish there. A big vote of thanks, please, to Anatol. Thank you, Anatol. And also, thank you very much to Aisha Siddiqa, Mohsin Hamid, and Ghazi Salahuddin for being on the panel. Thank you very much.
And can I add my thanks to the panel as well? I'm most grateful to you all.